Every now and again you'll get an indie horror game that comes out that just shines. Crow Country released on the 9th of May, just under a month ago. It's a horror game in the style of Silent Hill and Resident Evil survival horror games of old. It also had a fairly interesting story too. The story follows a young girl named Mara, a teenager who has ventured into the now closed down Crow Country amusement park in order to investigate the disappearance of the park's owner, Mr. Edward Crow. There's not really much else to cover in this intro except for the fact that there will be spoilers in this video for Crow Country, but without further ado, let's jump in. It's the year 1990 and Mara Forrest, Special Agent Mara Forrest, is driving through Crow Country, a piece of land owned by Mr. Edward Crow after he'd inherited it from his father. He'd built an amusement park on the land, also called Crow Country, and the park had been shut down 2 years prior after an accident at the park. It also happens that Mr. Crow has suddenly disappeared. Arriving, Mara parks up and sees another car there, and she finds blood on the ground. Shooting the padlock off of the gate, she ignores the no trespassing signs and enters the park. Mara is familiar with the place and comments on the fact that the prices at the park were always low. Heading further into the park, Mara finds a photo of something. She also discovers a man there lying on the ground and injured. His name is Arthur Mole. He's a paranormal photographer and enthusiast, and he says that he was attacked, that all he wanted was proof, a photo. Arthur had previously sent a photo into a paranormal magazine, but they claimed what he saw wasn't real, so he went back for another go. Mara can choose to help him or not, but let's just say for the sake of the story that Mara helped him. She helps him back to her car, and there, at least she knows that he'll be safe. Heading back to where she found Arthur, Mara finds that he was sat on something, a passcode for a tree lady. Heading down a dark corridor, Mara comes up against some grotesque creatures, monsters that she dispatches with her handgun. She finds a strange wooden crate filled with rocks that have small pieces of gold embedded in them. They had been sent by a Marvin Trumbull from Para in Brazil. Mara also finds a lounge room. Finding a unique passphrase for the fairy in the lounge room and returning to the fairy, Mara inputs the passcode and gains entry to the area that the tree fairy was in front of. It leads her to a room with a pool of water. It's pretty murky, and according to a staff memo, something has died inside a pipe and it's affected the water itself. After clearing up the issue by running the filter pump, the water clears. Mara shoots an underwater target, and the fairy pops up holding a bronze key. Monsters are now popping up all over the park. Avoiding them or killing them, key in hand, Mara uses it to enter the east side of the park. She's now somewhere called the Haunted Hilltop. She finds a woman named Julie there banging on a door, but Julie isn't very polite, but Mara says she'll try and find a way around in order to open the door. Mara finds her way into a break room, and after finding a useful crank handle, she opens the door letting Julie inside. She lays out some documents on the table and says that she's going to take a look inside a cell, and then she leaves. Basically, Julie is the attorney hired by the Marshall family. The Marshall's daughter Elaine had been injured by a man inside a cell in the park 2 years prior, and her family are holding Mr. Crow responsible. Elaine spent time in hospital, but the wounds she suffered weren't healing as a result of a strange and unidentified bacteria, leading to the doctors believing that she was in fact attacked by an animal and not a person. Despite repeated legal court summons sent to Mr. Crow, he hasn't shown up in court. Mara also finds an elevator in the room, but it appears to be offline. Mara checks in on Arthur, who says his leg hurts, and Mara then says that she needs to find Mr. Crow, as there's something she needs to tell him. Using the crank handle she obtained earlier, Mara then heads into the west side of the park, and this takes her to Ocean Kingdom. Inside an arcade, she speaks with a strange man. He introduces himself as Martin Trumbull, or Marv for short. He says that he and Mr. Crow are business partners. He's also looking for him. He says that he works overseas and has come back for a little visit, but obviously Crow has disappeared. Marv mentions a man named Tolman, that he's avoiding him, and that Tolman was Mr. Crow's root excavation guy, whatever that means. In the staff hallway, Mara sees a cage and something is inside. This something jumps out and attacks her, but she manages to kill it. What are these monsters? Mara later receives the first of many phone calls from a mysterious man. Whoever this person is seems to be watching her from somewhere. He says that Mara came back, and that he is glad to see Mara up and about, and then he hangs up. Finding a secret compartment, Mara heads into another area and into an office, where she finds a man inside, but he's dead. This is Douglas Pike, and he's the one who built the park. He's been killed by a gunshot, but Mara seems to think that it may have been self-inflicted. Then Mara watches a tape on a TV. It's Douglas Pike, and he expresses his concern about Mr. Crow's crimes and that his sins will not go unpunished. He mentions the injured girl Elaine Marshall, and he finishes by saying that he hopes that she never forgives them as they don't deserve it. Suddenly, his self-inflicted gunshot starts to look like it was done by someone else. Mara then comes across another person, this person who has been attacked and seems to be sick. Giving them some antidote, Mara speaks to the woman, who feels a bit better now, and she introduces herself as Natalie Crow. She's Edward Crow's daughter. Natalie is confused that after filing her missing persons report, that they'd send someone so young. She says that she spoke to a detective, Harrison James, and Mara says that the detective couldn't make it due to car trouble. Natalie says that in order to get into Crow's office, Mara needs a fancy gold key, and she needs to turn off the electrified door handle because, for some reason, Edward Crow decided to have his door electrified. What's he hiding? Anyway, with her new objective, Mara heads off to try and find a gold key. In the theatre, she finds the tree fairy there on the stage. Strange, it's almost as if she's been placed there purposely. With no other option but to explore the park some more, Mara speaks with a man. It's Detective Harrison James. He says that someone sabotaged his car by slashing his tyres. No prizes for guessing who did that. Anyway, after choosing whether or not to tell the detective where Natalie Crow is, Mara has some fun with some puzzles and receives a silver key. She uses this key to gain access to Mr. Tolman's office, and he's sat in there. Instead of greeting Mara, Tolman immediately comments on Mara's purple hair, saying that it doesn't look like a wig. It's a slightly odd thing to say. Mara says she's looking for Edward Crow, but Tolman isn't really helping. Tolman confirms what Marv said earlier, that Tolman is the root excavation guy, and Tolman says that Mara really does not want to know what the monsters are. Mara comments on the elevators being out of order, but Tolman tells Mara to work it out on her own, so Mara gets to work. She watches tapes of various disasters in date order, and letters flash up on the screen. She plays the corresponding notes on the keyboard, and pulling a lever, the red lights for the elevators turn green. Before she leaves, Tolman tells Mara that she should not go down there, that she'll regret it. Mara goes to the arcade, and after some intense gaming, she manages to obtain a data disc. Using the data disc, Mara plays around with some cells in the dungeon area and gets a bottle of acid. However, it's not full. She needs more. In the delivery garage, Mara finds a large crate which is shaking, and opening it, she discovers Julie inside. Julie says that she was grabbed from behind by someone, and Mara assumes this to be Marv, the weird guy she met earlier on. Mara heads down via the now unlocked elevators. She's now in an underground area, and she finds a diagram of where the gold key is, inside the head of the tree fairy. She finds Marv there along with Mr. Tolman, and they are standing in front of a strange green tube. Marv says that he still hasn't managed to find Mr. Crow. Tolman says that Marv is on the run from the Brazilian authorities and that he's come back to hide. Marv confesses and says that he and Mr. Crow were running an operation. They were selling gold from these green tubes that were called roots. Problem is that the gold that came out of the roots was 24 karat gold, way too pure, and there was way too much of it. We'll get to the particulars in a bit, but basically Marv had all of his assets seized, and now he's due in court, and since Crow had kept his name off of all of the paperwork regarding this operation that had gone missing, Marv was in big trouble. Marv is there to ensure that Crow gets his comeuppance. Leaving them to argue with one another, she comes across the detective down there too. He says that he got chased down there by a creature and that he's hiding there. He says that he ran into Natalie and says that she was acting weird, that she seemed ill. Mara also finds something disturbing, a body being dissolved via acid. Reaching over, Mara is able to fill up the jar of acid and heads back up to the theatre. Placing the acid into the tank, Mara shoots off the head of the fairy, then turns on the tap, melting the resin bubble that remains. And she grabs the gold key. Using the gold key, Mara opens up a door for the control room for the boat ride. Asking Julie for help, Mara jumps on board and Julie operates the controls. Reaching the end, Mara manages to obtain the battery from a diagram she found earlier on, but the battery needs charging. Returning to the control room, Mara finds Julie gone and some blood on the floor. Heading back underground, Mara finds somewhere to charge the battery. She goes back up to the surface and places the battery inside the large mechanical crow. The crow then speeds off, revealing an elevator behind it. Mara cannot use it yet though. Heading to the previously electrified door for Mr. Crow's office, Mara uses the gold key and heads inside. She finds a crate of gold ore, lots of medkits, ammunition and a slideshow. Mr. Crow knows all about the monsters, where they came from, and he's been studying them. She answers the ringing phone and it's the man again. It's Mr. Crow himself. He says that he's glad Mara is still alive, and he asks if Mara has been killing the monsters that he calls the guests. He then says that the guests cannot leave the park, or others will get infected. Heading into another room, Mara sees a creature on a monitor. She also sees her car in the parking lot. This is where Mr. Crow has been observing her from. After speaking to Arthur over the intercom, Mara powers up the elevator she found, and the creature from the monitor then bursts out of a hatch, but Mara takes it down. Natalie Crow is in the office now, and she asks Mara not to kill her father. Mara insists that she just wants to speak with him. Returning to the central elevator, Mara heads down, and unfortunately Mara finds the body of Detective Harrison down there. He's been shot. Mara says that she tried to her best to ensure that he didn't go to the park. A short ways further, Mara speaks with Tolman, who it seems is there waiting for her. Learning that a detective is shot, Tolman comes to a realization that Marv has come to the park to kill anyone who is aware of his and Mr. Crow's operation, and that includes Mr. Crow himself. Marv turns up, of course, but before he can do anything, Julie opens the vent and knocks Marv off of the platform, and he falls to his death. Getting her out the vent, she says that something grabbed her and dragged her into the vent, but bizarrely the creatures did not kill her. She says that they just shook her around and that they were just shouting, crying and making lots of noise. Tolman butts in and says that the creatures seem to want to communicate with them. Mara pushes forwards on her own, and after a long climb down a ladder, she comes to another room. It's clear that this is where Mr. Crow has been living. Mara finds a wall full of photographs of Natalie, Tolman, Mara, Julie, Arthur, Marvin, Douglas Pike and Detective Harrison. She finds a piece of paper which features a load of intelligible scribbles. He's also been researching things by the looks of it too, as 5 vials sit on the desk. Washing her hair, Mara's purple dye washes off and reveals her natural hair colour, brown. Exactly who is Mara? Speaking into the intercom, Mr. Crow calls Mara by her real name, Elaine. That's right, the young girl who got injured at Crow Country Park 2 years ago. After Elaine picks up the vials, he opens the door and she approaches Mr. Crow. He looks terrible. Before we jump into the ending, let's explore what on earth has been happening at this park. So when Edward Crow was 10 years old, he was about to go on a camping trip with his father in what was then Condor Country, and he was very excited. The following day, he and his father came across something strange, a green shiny tube. It was sticking out of the ground, and it was moving, despite it being made of copper. The next day, they found another one. Edward's father was intrigued, so he cut off the tip, and inside, he found gold. The day after that, they found 2 more. Edward's father immediately purchased the land, along with a couple of extra acres either side, and they would rename the land Crow Country. Edward's father would then pass away, and then Edward, who had recently become a widower, inherited the land. But Edward wasn't even interested in the gold, he just felt that he needed to finish what his father started. You see, there was so much gold that Edward didn't know what to do with it. He couldn't just sell it because he didn't want to attract the attentions of the US government, because this gold was 24 karat gold. In other words, it's the purest form of gold you can get. For example, in today's market, 1 kilogram of 24 karat gold is worth about $75,000, or about £58,000. Edward would then build a theme park on top of the land, calling the park Crow Country 2, and the park would be designed and built by Douglas Pike. Douglas put a lot of time and effort into the building of the park, and at some point during the construction process, Douglas's wife Ophelia died, and as a way to immortalize her, he created a lifelike waxwork of her and placed that inside of a coffin inside the park's crypt. Anyway, this park would just become a cover for Edward's gold harvesting operation. Edward and his business partner Marvin Trumbull were working on a plan to be able to excavate and then sell the gold. In 1986, Edward by this point had nicknamed the tubes Roots and had hired an excavation manager called Tolman. Tolman had initially hired a crew to help out with the excavation, and a dig site was set up inside the park. However, this turned out to be a mistake, as this crew not only took a long time to set the site up and were documenting everything, it was meant to be a quiet operation, they also demanded to know what it was they were excavating, so they were fired. A new method of excavation was drawn up, but it would not come cheap, and the park was in the process of having a new attraction installed called Cosmic Future. Around this time, Marv was sent by Edward to search for a gold mine, and he found an unused gold mine in Para, Brazil. Edward went to great lengths to ensure that this gold mine could not be traced back to him, and this involved Edward's name being on none of the paperwork, and only Marvin's name, which explains why Marv went to the park to try and find him. The new method of harvesting the gold was that an underground area was built, and that the 7 roots were cut underground, and then those sections are lifted up to the surface. The copper exterior shell is then separated from the gold, and the copper is burned. Using rocks as ore, the gold pieces would then be embedded into the rocks and sent back to Brazil. This was a perfect operation, in theory at least. A massive buyer was lined up, but Marv was concerned that people would be able to tell that the ore itself was not from Brazil. Nonetheless, they went ahead with the sale. Bad move, because Marv would then send a letter to Edward stating that the Brazilian authorities would be conducting a national inspection on the mine. This is serious. They'd obviously checked the ore for minerals and found that it wasn't from Brazil. Marv, in a desperate attempt to fool the authorities, then got a load of rocks and soil and had it delivered to the US. The gold was then embedded in the ore from Brazil and then shipped back to Marv. It was around this time that things started to go tits up in the park, but we'll get to that shortly. Marv then sent another letter to Edward asking if he got the shipment of rocks from Brazil, but Edward wasn't even picking up the phone. The plan was rumbled as Marv sent a final letter telling Edward that the authorities know that the gold isn't of Brazilian origin and they want to know where it's from. Marv then states that he's coming back to the US. But back home, of course, Edward Crowe was missing. So now we'll get on to the guests. When Mara is in Pike's office, she finds a note inside a filing cabinet which says that Edward suddenly pulled all of the funding for Cosmic Future. Pike says that Edward had changed, that there's a manic energy in his eyes, but that he suspected that Tolman and Crowe were up to something. Edward needed to pile all of his funds into building a new method of excavation. The underground area was built, and it was built around the 7 roots, and these roots were sitting in some type of liquid they nicknamed the pool. All of this obviously coincided with the operation that saw the ore being shipped out to Brazil. Now in 1988, everything changed. On the 21st of March 1988, Tolman was driving to work and Edward called him. There was an intruder alarm going off in the underground area. So Tolman checks out the security cameras and sure enough, there was someone down there standing by the pool, even though all of the doors were locked. A couple of days later, Tolman writes that Edward has contained the intruder in the lab and that Edward has called him the guest. But Edward didn't want to call an ambulance. He also said they should keep excavating, but Tolman was concerned. During this situation, Pike had overheard Edward and Tolman speaking and realized that they were up to something. Edward and Tolman then converted the storeroom into a holding cell, which Pike was not happy about, saying that they can't legally hold people inside a cell, but Tolman responds by telling Pike that it's not for criminals. Edward shut the guest inside the cell as he wanted to run tests. Tolman says that bringing the guest up to the surface is a bad idea, and it turns out that he's correct. On the 27th of March, Tolman would discover another alarm being triggered. 2 more guests had appeared in the pool room. Since the cameras were running, they have proof that these guests were coming from inside the pool. However, they are even more twisted up and broken. Deformed, Edward tried to talk to them for 23 minutes, but after getting nowhere, he shot them. 3 days later, Tolman writes that Edward has begun his experiments with the pool. He attached a key to a chain, and the key came out misshapen. A few months passed, and in July, Tolman, despite not having Edward's permission, turned off the excavation machines as Edward had become obsessed with the pool and the guests. He's ignoring all of Tolman's calls. And finally, let's talk about Elaine's accident. 15-year-old Elaine, there at the park on her birthday, having been separated from her parents whilst in the haunted hilltop area of the park, and having got lost, found her way into the cell area and encountered the guest in the cell, got injured, and had to go to hospital, forcing Edward to close the park. At the hospital, the doctors found that Elaine's wounds on her stomach and chest were not healing because of a strange unidentified bacteria. These wounds were so strange that doctors rejected Elaine's description of it being a person that attacked her, and instead attributed it to wounds sustained from an animal attack. Elaine's parents then hired an attorney, Julie Barron, and because they were holding Edward personally responsible, Edward was to pay Elaine's medical costs. He failed to pay, so a court summons was sent to Edward Crowe. But of course, since Edward had at this point disappeared, this summons was ignored, and a final summons was sent. This led to Julie Barron going to the park to track down Edward Crowe herself. Elaine, on the other hand, was dying, basically. Natalie Crowe had reported her father missing. Desperate for answers and not getting any better, Elaine escaped from the hospital, sabotaged the car of Detective Harrison James, who was assigned to the missing persons case, as she didn't want him to be in danger like she had been. She stole the missing persons file on Edward Crowe from the detective's car, and dyeing her hair purple, she disguised herself as an investigator and came up with the fake name Mara Forrest. She then arrived at the park, and this leads us back into the game. Speaking with Edward, it's clear that his obsession with the pool has taken a toll on him physically. He sat in front of the pool. He refers to Elaine as infected, but says that he's glad she came back. She tells Edward that they can't get rid of her infection, and that it's been getting worse. Edward assumes that Elaine wants to kill him, but she says that she just wants to tell him something. She tells Edward that she's dying. Edward says that anyone who's been exposed to the guests will be infected too. and this means Julie, Natalie, Arthur, Tolman, like Elaine and Edward, are all infected. Edward says that his continued exposure to the guests means that his condition has worsened quicker. He says that the same thing will happen to Elaine because of her close proximity to the guests. Elaine learns that Edward deliberately failed to pay Elaine's medical fees as he knew there was no cure for her condition. At least not at the hospital anyway. Edward then reveals that there is a cure, as he made one. He reverse engineered the infection and found a cure, and the cure is in the 5 vials that Elaine picked up from the desk. You see, Edward is a very skilled biochemist. The 5 vials he created are enough to cure 5 people, which means out of the 6 people alive and remaining, 1 will have to go without. But Edward solves this little conundrum by saying that he won't be taking a vial. He explains the pool to Elaine, that the 7 roots are coming up from its depths. He explains that the pool is a gateway, that the guests that came through it are humans that attempted to travel through it and ended up there at the park in 1998, 89, and 90. Edward goes on to explain that the guests look so terrible, as in cutting away the roots, which are effectively an antenna, to get the gold inside them, he's actually been dismantling the actual gateway itself, therefore the guests have been mangled badly whilst travelling through the gateway. It's now malfunctioning. Edward explains that the very first guest that came through the pool could just about speak. However, upon learning about who these people were, Edward went back to harvesting the gold inside the roots. Therefore, he would learn nothing else about the guests, as all subsequent guests could not speak. Edward says that he's going to throw himself into the pool to learn about the destruction that he's created, and he hands Elaine a piece of paper. The paper itself insinuates that the guests are actually from the year 2106. At some point, humanity will be exposed to a bacteria which will be capable of wiping out humanity, and Earth will become an uninhabitable ruin. This explains why the numbers 2106 were written all over the park, as the guests were trying to communicate but couldn't. This is why Tolman says that they aren't trying to kill humans, they are trying to communicate with them. Edward says that him mutating will be a fitting end, and he asks Elaine to kill him if he comes back up again. She reluctantly agrees. Edward then throws himself into the pool. As expected, he comes back a horrible, grotesque, mutated mess. Elaine fights him and eventually defeats him, killing Edward Crow. With the cure on hand, Elaine takes the cure along with the other 4, and they leave Crow Country, all reflecting on what it is they've been through, and the game then ends. And that is it. A pretty decent indie horror game with an interesting story. As for what the implications are for Edward Crow dying, well, we don't know. He and Elaine are the only ones who know about the bacteria that is coming to wipe out humanity and how to reverse engineer it for a cure. However, the ending doesn't show the characters actually taking their cure, and they all seem to be deep in thought. It turns out that the guests themselves picked the perfect time to come through the pool, as the correct technologies were there in terms of Edward being able to reverse engineer a cure in 1990, but early enough in time that lots of people weren't infected. Maybe it's set up here for a possible sequel, but who knows? I hope you enjoyed my explanation of the story. I really enjoyed playing this game and putting this video together. If you did enjoy the video, then please leave a like, it does me a massive favour. Subscribe too if you aren't already, and leave a comment below with your thoughts and theories, but for now take care and I will see you in the next one.